The taxi's headlights cut a dim yellow path through the curtain of rain, droplets streaking sideways as the wind picked up. Clara sat in the back seat, her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders, watching rivulets of water snake down the glass. It had been a long day of travel. Too many train changes, a missed bus, and now this winding, barely lit road toward a destination she had only read about in a crumpled letter. The driver, a quiet man with a face carved by years of sea air, said little, except to remark once that the old place had a way of making guests sleep like the dead. The words stuck in her mind, though she laughed them off politely. Outside, trees bent under the weight of the wind, and the road seemed to lead deeper and deeper into nowhere. When the car finally slowed, the first thing she saw was the flicker of a single lantern swinging above a carved wooden door. The building loomed higher than she expected, its dark stone walls glistening with rain, ivy clinging stubbornly to the sides. It wasn't the kind of hotel she had pictured. There were no gleaming windows or bright awnings, just heavy shutters, a steep slate roof, and the faint suggestion of chimneys releasing thin trails of smoke into the wet night. The sign read the Hotel of Sleep in weathered gold letters, the paint peeling like old parchment. Clara stepped out into the rain, her shoes splashing in shallow puddles, and for a moment, the air smelled of damp wood and something faintly sweet, like lavender. The front door opened before she could knock. A tall woman stood there, holding a brass oil lamp that cast a warm, steady light across her pale face. Her eyes were a gray so light they almost seemed silver, and she wore a long wool dress the color of midnight. "You're here," the woman said, as though she had been expecting Clara for years. Without asking for a name or reservation, she ushered her in, closing the door firmly against the storm. The sudden change was overwhelming. The air inside was warmer, richer, scented faintly with tea and burning cedar. The entrance hall was lined with shelves of books, their spines worn smooth, and thick rugs muffled the sound of her wet shoes. As Clara followed the woman, who introduced herself only as Madame Varenne. Deeper into the hotel, she noticed the peculiar hush that filled the space. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner felt measured, deliberate, as if it marked not ordinary minutes, but slower, heavier ones. The walls were hung with framed sketches of forests, seascapes, and sleeping figures, each rendered in delicate charcoal. The storm outside seemed distant now, muted, as though the thick walls drank in the noise. Madame Varenne led her up a staircase, the banister smooth under Clara's fingers, to a narrow corridor lit by a row of small oil lamps. At the far end, a door waited slightly ajar. Her room was nothing extravagant, but it felt strangely perfect. A four-poster bed draped in thick quilts, a small writing desk by the window, and a faintly crackling fireplace that must have been lit before she even arrived. On the nightstand sat a small ceramic cup filled with steaming herbal tea, and beside it, an old-fashioned silver key. "The tea is for rest," Madame Varenne said simply, placing the lamp on the desk. "Sleep comes easily here, but dreams linger." With that, she left, the sound of her steps fading down the hall. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the rain drum softly against the window. Something in the rhythm seemed to pull at her eyelids, though she wasn't ready to surrender just yet. She reached for the tea, inhaling its calming scent, and wondered what kind of place she had stepped into, and why it already felt like it had been waiting for her. Clara awoke sometime in the night, unsure at first why her eyes had opened. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly like watchful eyes from the hearth. The rain still tapped at the window, but slower now, like fingers tracing glass. She lay there listening, the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel steady against the storm. That was when she heard it, a sound so faint she thought it might be part of a dream. A murmur, low and steady, almost like a voice speaking from behind the walls. The words were too blurred to catch, but the rhythm was unmistakable. She sat up, holding the quilt close, scanning the shadows for movement. The sound seemed to come from near the window, but when she approached, there was nothing, just the dark stretch of the courtyard below, slick with rain. A few lanterns swayed gently, their light catching on wet stone. The courtyard was empty, yet she had the strange feeling someone had just been standing there, looking up. A shiver traced her spine. She drew the curtains and returned to the bed, telling herself it was just the wind in the eaves. Though her heartbeat argued otherwise, sleep did not come easily after that. She found herself drifting in and out, caught in fragments of dreams that felt too vivid to be dreams at all. Walking down a hall lined with doors, each slightly ajar, a hand reaching from the darkness, holding a small silver key, the echo of soft footsteps pacing just behind her. She woke each time with the sense that she was on the brink of remembering something important, something she had forgotten years ago. By the third time, she was almost afraid to close her eyes again. When morning finally came, it arrived gray and heavy. The storm had not fully passed. Rain still clung to the windows, and the air smelled of damp stone. Clara dressed and went downstairs, her footsteps muffled on the thick rugs. The common room was warm, the fire there blazing more brightly than she expected for so early in the day. A few other guests sat scattered in deep armchairs, reading or staring into the flames. None of them spoke. They all looked well-rested, blissfully so, but their stillness had a strange, heavy quality, as if they were reluctant to move too quickly, or at all. Madame Varenne appeared without sound, placing a tray of tea and warm bread on the low table in front of Clara. "You slept?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but her pale eyes searched Clara's face for something more than a yes or no. Clara hesitated before answering, unsure whether to admit what she'd heard. In the end, she simply said, "I think so." Madame Varenne's mouth curved into the faintest smile, though it did not reach her eyes. "The hotel takes care of its guests," she said softly, "even in dreams." The rain returned that evening, thin and steady, threading down the inn's windows like strands of glass. Evelyn sat at her usual table near the fire, a book open in front of her, but unread. The innkeeper was somewhere in the back, and the common room was otherwise empty, until the door opened. A gust of damp air swept in, carrying the scent of wet stone, and the man in the dark coat stepped inside. He shook the rain from his shoulders, scanning the room until his gaze settled on her. Without asking, he crossed to her table and took the seat opposite her. "You went to the bend," he said, his voice low, as though they were the only two people in the world. Evelyn's breath caught, but she managed a calm reply. "I did." He studied her for a long moment, his pale gray eyes unreadable. "Then you've seen something." It wasn't a question. She hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "I saw you," she admitted. A faint smile touched his lips, just enough to be noticed. "The river's selective," he said. "It doesn't show people unless there's a reason. And if it shows two people to each other." He let the thought trail off, as though the rest was obvious. Evelyn leaned back slightly, feeling both drawn in and wary. "And what reason would that be?" she asked. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something like recognition, or perhaps caution. "It means something is coming," he said finally. "Something that ties us both to this place. The river remembers what was, and it waits for what will be. But it doesn't tell us which is which." Before she could press him further, the innkeeper emerged from the back room, carrying a tray. His eyes flicked to the stranger, and for a moment the room felt taut, as if an invisible thread had been pulled tight. "You'll be wanting a room," the innkeeper said, his voice neutral. The man nodded once, then rose from the table. As he passed Evelyn, he murmured just loud enough for her to hear, "When it begins, you'll know. And you'll wish you hadn't asked." Then he was gone up the stairs, leaving behind the faint scent of rain and something older, harder to name. That night, the storm gathered with new force, rattling the shutters and sending long, hollow groans through the old timbers of the hotel. Clara lay in bed with the silver key in her hand, its surface catching the flicker of the firelight. She had turned it over countless times since finding the locked corridor, tracing the worn grooves, feeling the slight bend in its stem. It didn't look like it belonged to anything in her room. In fact, it didn't look like it belonged to this century at all. She knew she shouldn't test it. Madame Varenne's voice still lingered in her mind, but curiosity, once planted, was harder to put to bed than any restless thought. She waited until the hall outside her room was silent, the only sounds the rain and the slow creak of the building settling. Pulling on her coat, she stepped into the dim corridor, the oil lamps casting long shadows that seemed to sway as she moved. The hotel at night felt different, the air heavier, the silence deeper. She kept her steps light, listening for any sign of movement as she made her way toward the locked wing. The tall arched windows were dark mirrors now, reflecting her lone figure as she passed. When she reached the ornate door, her fingers hesitated on the cold, iron keyhole. The faint breathing she had heard earlier was still there, though quieter, as if whoever, or whatever, lay beyond had fallen into an even deeper slumber. The silver key slid into place with an ease that startled her, as though it had been waiting for her hand. She turned it slowly. A click echoed down the corridor, sharp in the stillness, and the door gave way with a soft sigh. Inside was a narrow chamber lit only by a single candle on a low table. The walls were bare stone, damp and cool to the touch. Against the far wall stood a simple bed, and on it, someone lay sleeping beneath a thin white sheet. Their face was turned away, hair dark against the pillow. Clara took one step closer and froze. The air in the room had changed. A smell of lavender, stronger now, mixed with something metallic, faint but unmistakable. She reached for the candle, but before her fingers touched it, the figure on the bed exhaled slowly and whispered her name. Clara stumbled back, heart pounding, slamming the door shut and twisting the key free. She didn't stop moving until she was back in her room. The key dropped carelessly onto the desk. Her breathing slowed, but sleep did not come willingly. When it did, it came all at once, heavy as lead. In her dream, she stood in that same stone room, but the bed was empty. The walls pulsed faintly as if alive, and words began to crawl across them in looping script. "You are not the first." She woke with a gasp just before dawn, the taste of lavender still on her tongue. By morning, the storm had slackened to a steady drizzle, but the air was still heavy and damp, clinging to the skin like a second layer. Clara dressed quickly, her mind still tangled in the fragments of the night before. The silver key sat exactly where she had dropped it on the desk, its dull sheen somehow more noticeable in daylight. She slipped it into her coat pocket without thinking, feeling its weight with every step as she descended to the common room. The fire was burning again, though the room was less crowded than usual. Only 3 guests were seated in the plush chairs, their gazes unfocused, eyes half-lidded as if they were still shaking off the last layers of sleep. In the far corner, by a window clouded with condensation, sat a man Clara had not seen before. His suit was outdated but well kept, and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses rested low on his nose. He wasn't reading or watching the fire. He was watching her. When she finally crossed the room and offered a tentative "good morning," he gestured to the empty seat beside him. His voice, when he spoke, was low but precise, each word deliberate. "You went into the East Wing last night." Clara froze mid-step. He smiled faintly, though it did not feel friendly. "It's always the new guests who find their way there. The old ones have learned better." She sat slowly, heart thudding in her chest. "What's in that room?" she asked. The man glanced toward the others in the room, then leaned closer. "Not what? Who?" He introduced himself as Mr. Bellamy and spoke in a tone that made her feel as though the two of them were already being overheard. "The sleepers in this place," he murmured. "They don't dream the way you think. The hotel? Here it's what they see, what they remember." He tapped the side of his temple with one finger. "It keeps the good ones fed, the bad ones locked away. But sometimes a dream slips through." Clara wanted to press for more, but his eyes flicked over her shoulder and his voice went flat. "Madame Varenne is watching." When she turned, the woman stood near the doorway, her pale gaze calm but unblinking. After that, Mr. Bellamy did not speak again. He simply rose, nodded once, and left by a side hall. Clara sat there for several minutes, staring into her untouched cup of tea. The thought of drinking it made her uneasy now. She felt as though she had just been handed a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and the other half hidden on purpose. Outside, the drizzle thickened again, the sound mingling with the crackle of the fire until it was hard to tell which belonged to the world outside and which to the walls themselves. That afternoon, the rain fell in thin, silvery threads, too soft to mask the creaks and sighs of the old building. Clara stayed in the common room longer than usual, partly hoping Mr. Bellamy might return, partly because she couldn't bring herself to linger alone in her room. A few guests sat scattered in their usual half-dream state, eyes drooping, bodies sinking into the cushions. One of them, a woman in a pale blue dress, was staring into the fireplace as if it were the only thing in the world worth looking at. There was something about her stillness that unsettled Clara. The woman's lips moved faintly, not in speech but in the slow rhythm of someone murmuring in their sleep. Her eyes, though open, were glassy, reflecting the flames without recognition. Clara glanced around. No one else seemed to notice. Leaning slightly closer, she caught a whisper, just a fragment. "Don't let them in." The fire cracked sharply, and the woman flinched, her eyes darting briefly to Clara's face. But instead of alarm, there was a strange vacancy, as if she had seen her from somewhere else. And then, without warning, Clara's vision shifted. It was as though the room had folded in on itself. The fire's glow brightened, filling her field of vision until the common room vanished entirely. She was standing in a different place, a garden under a moonless sky, the scent of wet earth heavy in the air. The woman in the blue dress was there too, standing several feet away, her face pale in the dim light. Around them, shadows moved at the edges of sight, too quick to follow. The woman's voice carried clearly now. "They follow you back if you open the wrong door." The next moment, Clara was back in the common room, the fire snapping and hissing as a fresh log caught flame. The woman sat as before, though her hands trembled slightly on the armrests. Madame Varenne entered just then, her presence as immediate as a sudden gust of wind. She set a hand lightly on the woman's shoulder, and the trembling stopped. Without acknowledging Clara, Madame Varenne guided her away, murmuring something too soft to catch. The other guests didn't stir, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Clara sat frozen in her chair, heart hammering. It hadn't felt like a daydream or a hallucination. It had felt real, the air in her lungs colder in that strange garden than in the common room. And the woman's warning, "If you open the wrong door," echoed with the weight of something Clara already feared she had done. Clara found Madame Varenne in the library, standing by a tall shelf and tracing her fingers over the spines as though reading them by touch alone. The air was thick with the smell of cedar and old paper, and the rain outside had shifted to a heavier, steadier rhythm that drummed against the leaded windows. Clara didn't waste time on pleasantries. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. "And don't tell me it's just an old hotel." Madame Varenne turned slowly, her pale eyes fixing on Clara's face as though she were studying a page. For a moment, there was only the sound of rain and the faint rustle of her dress. "It is a refuge," she said finally. "For the tired. For those whose dreams have been neglected." Clara stepped closer. "Then why do I keep seeing things I'm not supposed to? Why do your guests stare into nothing like they're trapped?" The corners of Madame Varenne's mouth curved into a faint, measured smile. "Because they are safe here. Safety can look like stillness to those who are restless." Before Clara could push further, Madame Varenne moved toward a small side table and lifted a silver tray. On it sat a teapot and two small porcelain cups, steam curling from their rims. "You are unsettled," she said, pouring the dark liquid into both cups. "The tea will help. It always helps." Clara hesitated. She had avoided the tea since her conversation with Mr. Bellamy, but refusing it now would be too obvious. She took the cup, letting the heat seep into her fingers without drinking. Madame Varenne lifted her own cup, sipping slowly, her eyes never leaving Clara's. "This place has its rules," she said quietly. "You have already broken one. I would hate for you to break another." The words were not a threat in tone, but the warning in them was unmistakable. Clara's pulse quickened. She raised the cup halfway, pretending to drink while the steam curled up into her face. The scent was heavier than before, lavender again, but laced with something bitter underneath. When Madame Varenne turned to set her cup down, Clara slipped hers to the edge of the table, spilling a few drops into the thick rug. They sank in instantly, leaving no trace. Madame Varenne glanced back, and for an instant, Clara thought she had been caught. But the woman only smiled again, this time with something colder in it. "Rest well tonight," she said, lifting the tray once more. "The dreams are most vivid after rain." That night, the rain was relentless, no gentle tapping on glass, but a constant, steady drumbeat that seemed to sink into the bones of the building. Clara lay awake for hours, telling herself the tea had been nothing more than a prop in Madame Varenne's little game. But sometime past midnight, the room began to feel heavier, as though the air had thickened. Her eyelids grew leaden despite her resistance. And when she finally gave in, sleep came all at once, swallowing her like deep water. She opened her eyes to find herself in the locked corridor. The oil lamps burned low, their light swaying in a draft she couldn't feel. The silver key was already in her hand. She didn't question how it got there. In the dream, everything had the inevitability of memory. The ornate door at the end seemed closer than before, its vine carvings glistening as if wet. She stepped forward, each footfall muffled, until her hand touched the cold iron keyhole. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the stone chamber was as she remembered, the single bed, the single candle, the damp air thick with lavender. But now the figure on the bed was facing her. It was a woman, her skin pale as moonlight, her dark hair spilling across the pillow. Her eyes were closed, but her lips moved faintly, forming words without sound. Clara stepped closer until she could hear them. A slow, steady repetition. "Wake me, wake me, wake me." The woman's eyes opened suddenly, and Clara stumbled back. They were the same pale gray as Madame Varenne's, but softer, filled with something closer to desperation than command. "You're not like the others," the sleeper said, her voice hoarse, as though unused for years. "You still dream for yourself." Clara's throat tightened. "Who are you?" The woman shook her head, a faint smile ghosting her lips. "Not who. What? I am the first guest who never left." The candle guttered violently, and the lavender scent grew so strong it was almost suffocating. The woman's voice rose with urgency. "The longer you stay, the more it takes. It will keep you, unless you take its key." Clara looked down at her hand. The silver key had turned black, its metal warm, almost pulsing. She reached for the bed, but the room shuddered as though struck by a great wind. In the next heartbeat, she was back in her own bed, gasping, the storm still raging outside. The key lay on her pillow, blackened and warm. Clara didn't bother with breakfast. She dressed quickly, shoved the blackened key deep into her coat pocket, and left her room without looking back. The common room was nearly empty. Only two guests sat before the fire, both perfectly still, their eyes half closed in that unsettling, dream-heavy way. Madame Varenne was nowhere in sight, and Clara took that as her chance. She crossed the tiled foyer, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and stepped into the rain that was worse than she expected. The downpour wasn't just heavy. It was thick, almost solid, the kind of rain that blurred the world into shifting shapes and shadows. The gravel path to the main road was nearly invisible, washed to muddy streams. Clara pressed forward, her coat instantly soaked through, her boots sinking into the muck. She could barely see 10 feet ahead, but she kept walking, every step a small rebellion against the hotel's pull. After what felt like 10 minutes, she stopped to catch her breath and looked back. The Hotel of Sleep still stood behind her, as clear as if she had only just stepped off the front porch. The path ahead curved into the trees, but a strange truth hit her. She had walked in a loop without realizing it. She tried again, this time keeping her eyes on the road, but the result was the same, a winding trail that led her back to those carved doors. Her pulse spiked. The storm wasn't just weather. It was a wall that a faint sound rose above the rain. Not thunder, but a low, droning hum that vibrated in her bones. It was the same note she had heard through the walls on her first night, now louder, alive. The trees beyond the path swayed in an unnatural rhythm, their branches bowing as if in time to the hum. And in the corner of her vision, something moved, tall, thin shapes in the curtain of rain, keeping pace with her no matter which way she turned. Soaked to the skin and shivering, Clara stumbled back toward the hotel. The carved doors opened without a touch, the warm air inside wrapping around her like a hand closing over her shoulders. Madame Varenne stood in the foyer now, her pale eyes unblinking. "The storm is for your protection," she said calmly, as though reading Clara's thoughts. "Out there, the dreams are unbound. You wouldn't like them without walls." Clara's fingers clenched around the blackened key in her pocket. Then maybe it's time to open the wrong door. The storm didn't ease by nightfall. It deepened, the rain turning to a restless roar, the hum in the walls now a low, constant presence that followed Clara from room to room. She had made her choice before the sun had even set. She wasn't going to be lulled, cornered, or kept. The blackened key was warm in her pocket, almost pulsing against her palm. The corridors were empty, the oil lamps burning lower than usual. their flames trembling like nervous witnesses. The walk to the east wing felt longer this time, the arched windows showing only darkness beyond, no reflection at all. When she reached the ornate door, she didn't hesitate. The key turned smoothly, as if the lock had been waiting for her. Inside, the sleeper sat upright in the narrow bed, candlelight sharpening the lines of her pale face. "You came back," she said, her voice steadier now. "You have the key. That means you can open more than just this door." Clara stepped closer. "If I let you go, will it let me go?" The sleeper's gaze softened. "It will try to keep us both, but together we might wake." The room darkened as a shadow filled the doorway. Madame Varenne stood there, her expression unreadable, her gray eyes fixed on the key in Clara's hand. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said evenly. "She isn't a prisoner. She's the anchor. Without her, this place falls apart, and so will you." Clara's fingers tightened on the key. Maybe that's the point. She turned it in the lock again, this time in a small iron door set into the wall that she hadn't noticed before. It opened onto pure darkness, the lavender scent surging like a wave. The sleeper reached for Clara's hand, and together they stepped forward. The hum rose into a shattering chord, the storm outside breaking in a single breathless instant. When Clara opened her eyes, she was lying in the back seat of a taxi, the road ahead lined with dripping trees under a pale dawn. The driver glanced back in the mirror. "Long night?" he asked casually. The hotel was gone from the rear window, nothing but mist and forest behind them. Clara pressed her hand into her coat pocket. The key was gone, but in her other hand, she still clutched a single sprig of lavender, warm as if it had just been plucked.